Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we really get into source material, articles, research, basically digging deep to pull out those crucial bits of knowledge, those insights. It's your shortcut to being, well, genuinely well-informed. Today we're tackling a huge one, a deep dive into a text that, it's revered by billions, right? Quoted everywhere, hotel drawers, courtrooms, the Bible. Our mission really is to unpack the source material we've reviewed. And this material, it specifically highlights what it calls the most striking contradictions within the Bible. So our goal is just to help you navigate this stuff, understand what really stands out from this particular critical look, and maybe gain a more nuanced view.
That's exactly it. And, this isn't about hunting for tiny typos or simple translation quirks. The sources we're drawing on, they really explore these deeply inconsistent accounts, teachings too, right from the beginning, the early chapters, and all the way through. It's quite a journey into the text's internal dynamics.
Absolutely. And our purpose here, look, it's to engage with this objectively, treating the Bible as, a major historical artifact, this incredibly rich collection of human writings. We'll explore what these internal contradictions, these tensions, might actually mean for how we understand the text itself. Think of it as a chance to get well-informed on a perspective that, well, it gets discussed, but maybe more behind closed doors. Yeah. Not often out in the open like this, analytically. So yeah, let's unpack it. All right, let's start this dive right where the Bible starts, in Genesis. Our sources, they immediately flag these two distinct creation stories. You've got Genesis chapter 1. It lays out God creating plants, then animals, and then humans, male and female, together. A specific sequence. But then literally just a few verses later, Genesis chapter 2 gives a different order. It's man created first, then plants, then animals, and woman is created last from the man. The sources are clear. These aren't just poetic versions. They're directly conflicting sequences.
And what's really interesting there is how scholars often look at this, not necessarily as mistakes, but maybe as evidence of different ancient traditions, literary or theological ones, being sort of woven together, preserved, each offering its own angle on creation, on humanity's place.
That's a really helpful way to think about it. It shows how early on you get these differing viewpoints right there in the text. And these kinds of, let's call them textual variations, they definitely don't stop there. Think about Noah's Ark, the flood story. Everyone knows the basics, right? But how many animals did Noah actually bring on board? Genesis 6 clearly says 2 of every kind. Simple enough. Yet, Genesis chapter 7 gets more specific. It says 7 pairs of every clean animal, the ones okay for sacrifice under ancient rules, and only 1 pair of the unclean animals.
And that specific detail, it really invites you to think about the story's internal consistency, doesn't it? If you were telling a story today about some major event and a basic logistical fact like that changed, was it 2 of each or maybe 14 of some and 2 of others? You'd naturally start asking questions about how accurate the account is.
Exactly. And it gets even more complex with something as foundational as the 10 Commandments. Most people just assume, okay, there's one list. But the sources point out the Bible actually has multiple versions. The list you find in Exodus chapter 20, it's different from the one in Deuteronomy chapter 5. And here's where it gets really interesting. Exodus chapter 34, it has another set of rules. And the text literally calls that list the 10 Commandments. This list includes some pretty unusual stuff like don't boil a young goat in its mother's milk. So, if you're trying to figure out which rules to follow, it begs the question, which list is the definitive 10 Commandments?
It certainly highlights the complexity right there in the core texts.
Right. Okay, let's shift gears a bit, move into the New Testament. Because these observations about internal variations, they keep coming up. Take the resurrection of Jesus, often called the absolute cornerstone of Christianity, yeah. Well, our sources highlight 4 distinct accounts, one in each gospel. Yeah. And they all have different details. Matthew. An angel rolls the stone away, talks to the women.
Okay.
Mark. The stone's already gone, and there's a young man inside the tomb. Oh. Luke. It's 2 men in shining clothes. And then John's account is different again. Mary Magdalene finds the stone gone, runs to tell the disciples, only later sees 2 angels inside. So the number of visitors, what they actually saw, what they were told, even when they first saw the risen Jesus, it all varies.
And what's significant there, as the sources point out, is that these aren't just tiny differences in wording. They feel like fundamentally distinct narratives describing the same pivotal moment. It really makes you consider how these stories were being shaped and passed around in those early Christian communities.
It's pretty striking, yeah. Seeing those variations on such a central event. Our sources also dig into what they call another perplexing area, the genealogies of Jesus.
Yeah.
Both Matthew and Luke trace his lineage back, right?
Yeah.
But the names, they just don't match up. One line goes through Solomon, David's son. The other goes through Nathan, another son of David. And get this, one list has 28 generations between David and Jesus, the other counts 43. I mean, they can't both be spot on with the specifics, can they?
Seems unlikely.
Plus, there's this logical point the sources raise. If the core belief is the virgin birth, then why does Joseph's genealogy matter so much? Yet both Matthew and Luke clearly present Joseph's line. It's curious. And if we zoom out a bit, the Bible doesn't just show variations in historical details. It happens with core theological ideas too.
Yeah.
Think about salvation. How does someone get saved or justified? It's pretty central. Well, in Romans chapter 3, Paul writes very clearly, a person is justified by faith, not by works. Belief alone makes you right with God.
Okay, faith alone.
But then you flip over to the book of James, chapter 2, and it says, a person is justified by works, not by faith alone. Actions are crucial. These sound like, well, completely opposite instructions on how you achieve spiritual standing.
And that specific tension, faith versus works, that was a massive point of debate for centuries. It fueled huge movements like the Reformation. It really encourages us to see that even within a sacred text, you can find what looks like an ongoing theological conversation rather than just one single fixed answer.
That's a great point, and it even applies to how God himself is portrayed. The nature of God seems to shift across the different books. In parts of Exodus, for instance, God is described as jealous, even punishing children for what their parents did.
Right, that's a tough one.
But then you read 1 John and it simply says God is love, just pure love. Our sources really highlight that contrast. One picture is powerful, sometimes angry, focused on justice. The other is all about boundless compassion. Trying to reconcile those often means seeing the Bible as this collection that reflects changing ideas about God over hundreds of years, not just one static concept.
A sort of evolving understanding, perhaps.
Exactly. Now, let's dig into the laws themselves, because the Bible gives laws, but even those show internal variations that could really impact daily life or how people see morality, like dietary laws. Leviticus 11, it clearly prohibits eating shellfish, things like that. Forbidden.
Standard Old Testament law.
But then fast forward to Mark chapter 7, and Jesus seems to declare all foods clean.
Yeah.
And later in Acts, Peter has this vision, right? And he's basically told, go ahead, eat the unclean animals. Our sources see these not just as minor tweaks, but pretty significant shifts in direction.
A clear change in perspective there.
Yeah, and you see a similar pattern with Sabbath laws.
Yeah.
Exodus is strict. Break the Sabbath, the penalty is death. Very serious.
Extremely serious.
Yet in the New Testament, Paul writes in Colossians, telling people not to let anyone judge them on how they observe the Sabbath or festivals or new moons. This gets particularly interesting when you remember Jesus himself reportedly said that not one jot or tittle, not the smallest stroke of the law, would disappear. So it raises questions. Are the old laws still fully binding, or did something change?
It really does vividly illustrate that ongoing tension you find in many religious traditions, doesn't it? That push and pull between holding on to ancient customs and adapting to new interpretations or maybe changing circumstances. It's a dynamic process.
Absolutely. And then you've got just plain numerical contradictions, like the census David took. In 2 Samuel chapter 24, it says God told David to take the census. Seems straightforward.
Okay.
But then you read the parallel account in 1 Chronicles chapter 21, and it says Satan prompted David to do it.
Oh, that's a big difference in who's initiating it.
Right, God or Satan.
Yeah.
Pretty different sources for the command. And then the numbers themselves are off. Samuel counts 800,000 fighting men from Israel and 500,000 from Judah. Chronicles. He gives 1.1 million for Israel and 470,000 for Judah.
Wow. Those aren't small discrepancies either. We're talking hundreds of thousands?
Exactly. These are significant differences in numbers recorded in two different books about the same event. Another area the sources dive into is that classic theological problem. If God is all-powerful and all-loving, why is there so much suffering? The problem of evil. The Bible definitely wrestles with this, but our sources suggest it does so in ways that can seem contradictory. You have the book of Job, where God essentially allows Satan to completely ruin a righteous man's life just to prove a point.
A very difficult story to grapple with.
And then in Romans chapter 9, Paul writes something quite startling, that God actually makes some people just to destroy them so his power can be shown.
That's a hard verse.
Yeah. And beyond that, there are these accounts where God is depicted as bringing about massive destruction, wiping out cities, including infants, pregnant women, even animals, often as a first resort punishment. Our sources suggest this picture can be hard to square with the idea of a purely loving and just God.
It raises profound theological questions about justice and mercy.
And this theme of moral interpretation comes up strongly when you look at how biblical morality lines up with, say, modern ethical thinking. Slavery is a huge one. The text, particularly the Old Testament, but also parts of the New, seems to repeatedly condone slavery. It gives rules for buying, selling, beating, even inheriting slaves.
Yes, those passages are certainly present.
There's no clear commandment saying, thou shalt not own another person. Yet you also have Paul writing in Galatians, there is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, for you are all one in Christ Jesus.
A very different sentiment.
It presents a stark contrast, right?
Yeah.
Leading to the question, within this text, is slavery acceptable or isn't it? Can you derive both answers from the same book?
And that specific issue really highlights how interpretations of ancient texts inevitably evolve, doesn't it? How societal values shift, and people reread foundational documents through new ethical lenses.
For sure. And it's not just internal contradictions. The sources also point out areas where the Bible's descriptions of the world or its historical accounts seem to clash with, well, observable reality or scientific consensus. I mean, things like the Earth being only 6,000 years old, or talking snakes,
Right.
or people surviving inside a giant fish for 3 days, or the sun literally stopping in the sky. The sources note these were often presented and believed as literal history for centuries. Though, to be fair, many religious scholars today interpret these parts metaphorically or theologically, not as literal science or history.
Yes, the approach to interpretation has certainly shifted for many.
Okay, going deeper into the New Testament, the divergences keep popping up, even in really specific key moments, like Jesus' very last words on the cross. Matthew and Mark both record him crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" A cry of anguish, it seems.
A powerful line.
But in Luke, his final words are different. "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." Much more peaceful, trusting. And then in John, it's different again, just 3 words. It is finished, a statement of completion.
Mm-hmm.
So our sources stress these are distinct sayings. They're mutually exclusive as the final utterance. Unless he said all 3, one after another, which isn't implied, then the Gospels are offering different accounts of his last words. Then there's the whole complex area of prophecy and fulfillment. Matthew's Gospel is really big on showing how Jesus fulfilled Old Testament prophecies. But sometimes the sources argue the connection seems strained. Like Matthew says Jesus fulfilled a prophecy about being called a Nazarene.
Okay.
But the sources point out there isn't actually a specific Old Testament prophecy that says the Messiah will be called a Nazarene.
Mm-hmm.
Matthew also describes Jesus riding into Jerusalem on both a donkey and a colt, seemingly to fulfill Zechariah 9.9 literally.
Right, the 2 animals.
But if you look at Zechariah, most scholars see it as Hebrew poetic parallelism, mentioning a donkey, even a colt referring to just one animal. Matthew seems to have taken the "and" hyper-literally.
An interpretive choice, perhaps.
And the sources also bring up prophecies that just didn't seem to happen as written. Ezekiel predicted King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon would completely destroy the city of Tyre.
Did that happen?
Nope. Nebuchadnezzar besieged it, damaged it, but didn't destroy it. Alexander the Great did that centuries later. So that specific prophecy failed. Even Jesus' own predictions about the end times in Matthew 24. He says very clearly, this generation will not pass away until all of these things, signs of the end, have happened.
And it did pass away.
Right. That generation died and the final end didn't arrive. Paul also wrote as if he expected the world to end in his own lifetime. The sources kind of characterize this as shifting the goalposts over time.
These examples definitely prompt a closer look at how biblical prophecy is understood. Maybe less about precise, literal prediction, and more about interpreting events through a theological lens, adapting narratives over time. It makes you think about the purpose of prophecy itself in these texts.
That makes sense. Another tension the sources highlight is between free will and, well, divine control, or maybe manipulation. The classic example is Pharaoh in Exodus. The text says multiple times that God hardened Pharaoh's heart, made him refuse to let the Israelites go.
Yes, it explicitly states that.
And then God punishes Pharaoh and Egypt severely for the decisions Pharaoh apparently couldn't help but make because God had hardened his heart. So was Pharaoh acting freely, or was he a puppet? It raises deep questions about justice and agency right there in the narrative.
A profound theological dilemma.
We also see what look like straightforward historical inconsistencies. Luke's gospel tries to date Jesus' birth very precisely. It mentions a census that took place when Quirinius was governor of Syria. History tells us that census happened around 6 CE, 6 AD.
Okay, a specific date.
But Luke also says Jesus was born during the reign of King Herod the Great. And we know Herod died in 4 BCE.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. There's a gap of at least 10 years between Herod's death and Quirinius' census. They didn't overlap. So trying to place the birth during both periods seems historically impossible based on external records.
That's a significant chronological challenge for the narrative.
And the inconsistencies can get even more detailed. Look at Paul's conversion story on the road to Damascus. It's a pivotal moment, told 3 times in the book of Acts.
Right, a key event for Paul.
But the accounts don't quite match up. In Acts chapter 9, the men traveling with Paul hear the voice speaking to him, but they see no one. Okay, Acts 22. Paul retells the story. This time the men see the bright light, but they don't hear the voice.
Opposite detail.
Exactly. And then in Acts 26, Paul tells the story again to King Agrippa, and his version has slightly different nuances again. This isn't someone else reporting it. It's presented as Paul's own testimony, but the details shift each time it's told within the same book.
That's quite remarkable, isn't it, for such a foundational story?
It really is. And you see a similar thing with the death of Judas Iscariot, the disciple who betrayed Jesus. How did he die? Matthew's gospel says Judas, filled with remorse, returned the silver coins, threw them into the temple, went out and hanged himself. A suicide by hanging.
Okay, clear cause of death.
But then you read the book of Acts, chapter 1, it gives a totally different story. It says Judas bought a field with the money, or the priest did with the money he returned, depending on interpretation. And there he fell headlong. His body burst open and all his intestines spilled out.
Whoa, that's graphically different.
Completely different. Hanging versus falling and bursting open. These are fundamentally incompatible ways to die. Both can't be literally true for the same event.
Yeah, when you have such starkly different accounts for something pretty significant, like how an infamous figure died, it definitely makes you pause and think about the reliability or consistency of the narratives, doesn't it?
It certainly does. Then there's a more subtle theological point the sources raise. How God is portrayed when it comes to truth and deception. Proverbs says pretty clearly, the Lord detests lying lips. God hates lies.
A straightforward moral stance.
But then, in 2 Thessalonians, there's a passage suggesting that God sends people a powerful delusion so that they will believe the lie as part of judgment. And in 1 Kings chapter 22, there's a scene in God's heavenly court where God actually allows a lying spirit to go and deceive King Ahab's prophets, leading Ahab to his death.
So is God using deception there?
It seems like it, right? So the question becomes, is God always against lies? Or does the Bible sometimes portray God using deception as a tool, perhaps for a greater purpose within the narrative? Both ideas seem present in the text.
That's a complex theological knot to untangle.
And look at Satan. His character seems to change dramatically between the Old and New Testaments. In the Old Testament, he's not really the ultimate evil figure yet. In Job, Satan acts more like a prosecutor, an adversary in God's own divine counsel, testing Job with God's permission. He's part of the heavenly scene.
Right, a different role.
But by the time you get to the New Testament, wow! He's transformed into the ultimate enemy, the cosmic ruler of darkness, the tempter cast out of heaven. This huge shift in his role and nature isn't really explained within the Bible itself. It just sort of happens between the testaments. Yet so much theology about evil is built on that later picture.
That evolution of the figure of Satan is definitely something scholars track.
Okay, what about prayer? Does the Bible give a consistent message on its purpose and effectiveness? Jesus says in Matthew pretty plainly, ask whatever you wish and it will be done for you if you remain in him and his words remain in you. It sounds like a blank check almost.
A very strong promise.
But then James writes, you ask and do not receive because you ask wrongly with bad motives. So effectiveness depends on your inner state.
Okay, a condition is added.
And in some places, prayer seems incredibly powerful, moving mountains. In others, like maybe Jesus in Gethsemane asking for the cup to pass, it seems unanswered or answered with a no. Plus, Matthew also has Jesus saying, God already knows what you need before you even ask. So
yeah.
If God already knows, and then sometimes the answer is no, and effectiveness depends on motives, it makes you ponder, what is the ultimate point of praying, according to these different texts?
It suggests prayer might serve multiple purposes: relationship, alignment, petition, not just getting what you ask for.
That's a good way to frame it. Now, consider marriage standards. This is another area where things seem to shift. In the Old Testament, polygamy, having multiple wives, isn't just tolerated. It's practiced by major figures like King David and King Solomon. Solomon supposedly had hundreds of wives and concubines. It's presented without condemnation.
Yes, it was culturally accepted in that period and reflected in the text.
But then you get to the New Testament, and the clear norm becomes monogamy. One man, one woman. Bishops and deacons are explicitly required to be the husband of one wife. So the sources ask, if these are divinely inspired texts, why does God's apparent view on the structure of marriage seem to change so much over time? Does it reflect evolving human culture more than a fixed divine rule?
It points to that interplay between divine principles and cultural contexts again.
And what about judging others? The Bible seems to give conflicting advice here too. Matthew's gospel famously has Jesus saying, "Do not judge, or you too will be judged." Pretty clear command against judging.
A very well-known verse.
But just a few verses later, in the same Sermon on the Mount, Jesus tells his followers to watch out for false prophets, and you will recognize them by their fruits. That sounds an awful lot like making a judgment based on actions.
Yeah, you have to assess the fruits.
And then Paul, writing in 1 Corinthians, says, the spiritual person judges all things, but is himself judged by no one. So for someone reading this, it's confusing. Are you supposed to judge? Not judge. Judge some things, but not others. The signals seem mixed.
It suggests maybe different kinds of judgment are being talked about, or perhaps just reflects different perspectives from different authors or situations.
Maybe. Gender roles, too, another hot topic where the Bible presents contrasting ideas. Genesis 1 says God created mankind in his own image. Male and female, he created them. Sounds pretty equal right from the start. Co-imagers of God.
A foundational statement of equality there.
But then fast forward to the New Testament, particularly some of Paul's letters like 1 Timothy or 1 Corinthians. You get instructions for women to be silent in churches, not to teach or have authority over men. 1 Timothy even suggests women are saved through childbearing.
Yes, those are challenging passages for modern readers.
They really are. Our sources highlight how these instructions seem to diverge sharply, not just from that Genesis ideal, but also clash with, basic principles of human dignity and equality that most people, including many believers, hold today. It requires a lot of interpretive work to reconcile.
Definitely a source of ongoing debate and reinterpretation within faith communities.
Okay, one last specific example. Can you actually see God? The Bible seems to say both yes and no. Exodus 33:2 is blunt. God tells Moses, you cannot see my face, for no one may see me and live. Can't see God and survive. John 1:1a repeats, no one has ever seen God.
Seems pretty definitive, no seeing God.
But other passages describe exactly that. Exodus 33 itself ends with Moses seeing God's back. Genesis 32 describes Jacob wrestling with God, or an angel, depending on interpretation, face to face, and his life is spared. Isaiah chapter 6 has Isaiah seeing the Lord sitting on a throne, high and exalted.
So direct visual encounters are described.
Yeah. The text seems to contain both the explicit prohibition, you can't see God, and narrative accounts of people seemingly doing just that. Both claims exist side by side.
And time after time, these examples really drive home the point, don't they? The Bible often holds onto these diverse, sometimes clashing voices. It preserves them without necessarily smoothing out the rough edges or resolving the conflicts. It reflects perhaps the real internal debates, the evolving thoughts, the rich and sometimes messy theological discussions that were happening in ancient communities as they tried to understand God and their world.
Okay, so we've gone through a lot of examples here drawn from the sources. The big question now is, what does all this actually mean? For you, the listener, how might this affect how you approach this huge, influential text?
Well, I think what's really illuminating when you look at all these variations together is that they paint a picture. They suggest the Bible isn't one single book dictated word for word, but more like a library, a collection of diverse writings, different authors, different times, sometimes holding really different beliefs or perspectives. It becomes this incredible record of human struggles, our evolving ideas about the divine, ancient fears, foundational stories, myths. It reflects the complex, often debated theological landscape of people trying to make sense of it all, their world, their relationship with whatever they perceived as ultimate reality.
And this can lead to what our sources see as moments of pretty stark moral tension within that library. For instance, the book of Deuteronomy lays out a law. If parents have a persistently rebellious son, they should bring him to the elders, and the community should stone him to death.
Yeah, that's in Deuteronomy 21.
It's presented as a legal command. And that exists right alongside verses, sometimes in the very same books, talking about God being merciful and loving, slow to anger. It creates a kind of moral whiplash almost.
And connecting that to the bigger picture, it's also worth remembering, as historians point out, the Bible we hold today, it's the product of centuries of discussion, debate, decisions about which books made it in, which were left out. Think about things like the Council of Nicaea in the 4th century. These were gatherings where early church leaders hammered out key doctrines, decided on the canon. So the Bible itself is partly the result of human choices, compromises, and historical processes. It's not necessarily the complete, unfiltered record of all early beliefs.
That's such an important context.
Yeah.
Because as our sources emphasize, this matters profoundly today. People make huge life decisions based on this book. Its interpretation influences laws, fuels debates about rights, has justified wars, guided how kids are raised. I mean, the impact is immense. People use it to back up political views, sometimes to dismiss science, often to judge others. Even though, as we've just discussed, the book itself seems full of these internal inconsistencies, different narratives, opposing viewpoints. So what's the takeaway? The sources argue these contradictions aren't just flaws to ignore or explain away. They're actually clues.
Clues to what?
Clues that the Bible is a profoundly human document, put together by committees, copied and maybe altered by scribes over centuries, translated with inherent biases, sometimes edited to support certain power structures. These inconsistencies, they're like the fingerprints of the many human hands involved in shaping it. There's a real irony there, isn't there? The Bible itself says in 1 Corinthians, God is not the author of confusion. Yet, reading it critically, it can often feel complex, ambiguous, even confusing.
Which prompts that interesting question. Why do we often grant the Bible a level of acceptance for internal variation that we probably wouldn't accept in, say, a modern science textbook or a history book, or even just an instruction manual for putting together furniture? We'd expect more consistency there, wouldn't we?
We absolutely would. And maybe one of the most revealing points our sources make is about this tension between the Bible's claimed authority and its actual ambiguity.
Yeah.
It's held up as the bedrock of truth, the moral compass. Yet, as we've seen, you can use the same text to argue for completely opposite things.
Right.
Justify slavery, condemn slavery, justify war, promote peace, argue for oppressing women, argue for their dignity. Depending on which verses you pick and choose, which ones you emphasize or ignore, you can arrive at totally different conclusions. That's not necessarily moral clarity. It's a kind of interpretive chaos, or at least extreme flexibility.
And that flexibility might be why interpretations often shift over time, adapting to fit better with current ethical ideas. People highlight the verses that resonate now and tend to downplay or explain away the ones that don't.
Yeah.
It shows that dynamic interaction between an ancient text and evolving modern values.
Exactly, which brings us to a critical point the sources raise. If a text claims to be timeless truth, shouldn't every part of it hold up consistently? If you have to keep saying, oh, that part was just for its time, or that part is metaphorical, not literal, to make it morally acceptable today, then how timeless is it, really? You can't easily claim direct, perfect, divine inspiration and then simultaneously act as an editor, picking and choosing which bits of the divine message still apply or need reinterpreting. The identity of Jesus himself is a prime example. In John's Gospel, Jesus says things like, I and the Father are one, strongly suggesting divinity, unity.
A key text for Trinitarian doctrine.
But then in Mark's Gospel, when someone calls him good teacher, Jesus replies, why do you call me good? No one is good except God alone. That seems to draw a distinction between himself and God.
Yes, that verse is often cited by those questioning his full divinity.
Our sources suggest this reflects genuine theological debates happening in those early Christian communities before the doctrine of the Trinity was fully formulated and standardized centuries later. The texts preserve those different viewpoints. If the Bible landed on a publisher's desk today, the sources argue, it wouldn't get published as one single coherent book. It would probably be broken up. Here's a collection of ancient folklore. Here's some archaic law codes. Here's some beautiful poetry. Here's some mythology. And here's a compilation of very diverse, sometimes contradictory theological writings. No modern editor would likely let a single volume with such internal inconsistencies go to print.
Which leads back to that question, why is it treated so differently? Why is it often shielded from the kind of basic critical reading and analysis we'd apply to almost any other ancient document or piece of literature?
Think about forgiveness.
Yeah.
In some places, God's forgiveness seems abundant, free. Jesus teaches forgiving 70 times 7.
The ideal of grace.
But then you have Hebrews saying, quite starkly, without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. Forgiveness requires a sacrifice, a payment. It sounds transactional.
A very different model.
It clashes with the idea of unconditional forgiveness. If forgiveness is the ultimate virtue, why doesn't the text consistently portray God modeling it without requiring a prior transaction? Or faith itself. Hebrews defines faith as the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. very conceptual.
Hmm.
But James insists faith without works is dead. Faith has to be proven by actions. And Romans, as we said, argues salvation is by faith alone, apart from works.
Three different takes on faith's nature and role.
Exactly. And these aren't trivial differences. Entire denominations have split. Wars have literally been fought over how to interpret these specific verses about faith, works, and salvation. And finally, the sources circle back to what they see as moral double standards embedded in the text. Killing is a sin. Unless God commands it, like with the Canaanites, lying is wrong. Unless it's Rahab lying to protect God's spies, which is praised, genocide is abhorrent, unless it's divinely ordered against enemy nations.
Difficult passages, no doubt.
These ethical complexities are presented often without internal critique. The sources suggest they reflect ancient tribal loyalties, us versus them thinking, perhaps more than a universal, unchanging divine morality. And interpretations of these passages have certainly been used to justify terrible things throughout history.
It definitely forces you to ask about the moral authority of a text that can seemingly be used to endorse both profound compassion and acts of extreme prejudice or violence.
Even when it comes to death and what happens next, the Bible offers different scenarios. Some verses imply you go immediately to heaven or hell, or paradise torment. Jesus tells the thief on the cross, "Today you will be with me in paradise." Sounds immediate.
Right, the immediate transition.
But other passages, especially in Paul's writings, talk about the dead sleeping until a future resurrection day, when everyone will be raised and judged.
A delayed event.
And the book of Revelation describes a final judgment day. But it happens after many passages seem to imply the dead have already received some kind of judgment replacement. The timelines and sequences seem to vary. They can't all be literally true simultaneously. They represent different strands of belief about the afterlife woven together.
A tapestry of different eschatological views.
So,
Yeah.
okay, we've done this deep dive, looked at all these complexities highlighted by our sources. What does it all boil down to? What does this mean for you, the listener, as you navigate information, deal with complex texts, maybe wrestle with your own beliefs?
I think it really reinforces the idea that truly understanding any complex text, especially one as ancient and influential as the Bible, means engaging with it honestly, clearly, critically. It means moving beyond perhaps just simple reverence to develop a more nuanced appreciation of its reality as a historical artifact, a literary collection, a product of human hands and minds wrestling with ultimate questions over centuries.
Yeah, and our sources essentially conclude that the Bible is this incredible, powerful, yet deeply complex and, yes, flawed book. It was written by diverse, flawed people living in flawed societies over a vast stretch of time. It absolutely contains moments of breathtaking kindness, deep wisdom, and profound love. And it also contains passages that depict shocking cruelty, ideas that support oppression, and commands that feel morally troubling today. And as we've spent this time exploring, it contradicts itself, or at least contains significant internal variations and tensions, often enough that any simple claim to absolute monolithic divine perfection or perfect historical accuracy seems to crumble under close, careful reading. Which leads to maybe a final thought, something for you to consider. If a text claims to be a universal, eternal standard, yet it requires so much constant reinterpretation, selective reading, and explaining away of difficult parts just to keep it relevant or morally coherent for us today, what does that actually tell us about the nature of its supposedly timeless wisdom?
That's a powerful question to reflect on.
Ultimately, the purpose of this deep dive, like all our dives, isn't to tell you what to believe or disbelieve. It's about giving you the tools, the information, the perspectives to be genuinely well-informed, to feel equipped to ask the hard questions, to think critically, and to approach all sources of knowledge, whether they're considered sacred or secular, with an open but always discerning mind. So after all that, what stands out most to you from this particular dive? Something to think about.